Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. On the 2nd of November 1917, Lord Arthur Balfour, who was the British Foreign Minister at the time, sent a letter to Lord Rothschild, which read, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." Well, today marks the 103rd anniversary, if you like, of the issuing of this letter. And we will hear from our speakers how that letter was used to then, if you like, foist on the Palestinians all the problems that they have had ever since. My name is Professor Kamel Hawash. I'm an academic at the University of Birmingham. I'm the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and a founding member of the British Palestinian Policy Council. It really is an honor to be chairing this particular panel. I wish I didn't have to do this 103 years later. I wish the anniversaries we were commemorating were celebrations of the freedom of the Palestinian people. This will come, we are confident, but for now we are commemorating this particular anniversary. I myself am originally from Jerusalem, and in 2017 Israel denied me entry into Jerusalem. So you see that the impact of this declaration lives on for a bit of time. This particular webinar is organized by the Palestinian Return Center, and I've been asked to just briefly introduce one of their major campaigns, which is the My Return campaign, and to encourage online viewers to sign by simply going to myreturn.net. It's a voluntary popular initiative launched by the PRC in cooperation with national and international pro-Palestine partners. And the campaign was first launched in Jordan in cooperation with Palestine Committee in the Jordanian Parliament. The campaign culminates in a petition that calls for and reaffirms the Palestinian right of return, and it seeks to turn such an inalienable right into an international cause. So I do urge people to go to myreturn.net and to sign that. We have an excellent panel to introduce to you. I'll introduce them when they start speaking, but in reverse order, we have Ms. Malia Bouattia, who will be speaking third, if you like. Dr. Maria Holt will be speaking second, and it is a real honor and pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, who is a Palestinian researcher most known for his groundbreaking project mapping of Palestine in the 21st, 20th, and 19th centuries, and developing a practical plan for implementing the Palestinian right of return of Palestinian refugees. He will be focusing on the history of the Balfour Declaration and its immediate impacts on Palestinians from 1917 to the present. Both myself and Dr. Salman, I think, are civil engineers, Dr. Salman, as far as I know. So that is where the engineering ends, and it's a real pleasure to be introducing you. And we'll have about 15 minutes or so to talk about this very, very important topic. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hawash. Well, the title is From Balfour to Boris. Yes, indeed, from Balfour to Boris. From Balfour, the anti-Semite who formulated the Aliens Act in 1905 to prevent European Jews from coming to England and wanted to ship them out to Palestine, where they can be more useful for the British Empire. And to Boris, the grandchild of a Turkish Muslim who turned against his origin and his religion. But in between these two, there is a long trail of politicians who did not repent from the original sin. This is a case of betrayal by Britain of its solemn undertaking to bring freedom and independence to Palestine. Instead, it brought death and destruction to the Holy Land and waged a 100-year war against a peaceful people. 100 years of death and destruction of Palestine and the dispersion of its people. 100 years of violating every article in human rights and international law. A violation of Britain's own undertaking. All this without remedy or recourse. Originally, Britain was entrusted with building government institutions in Palestine and also in Iraq. Both were classified as Mandate Class A. Iraq became independent and Palestine was betrayed. And that was supposed to be in the fulfillment of the sacred trust of civilization, according to Article 22 of the Charter of the League of Nations. But instead, Palestine was converted into a colonial project for the benefit of European Jewish colonists who were not even inhabitants of the country. In fact, it was worse than a colonial project. Unlike any other colonial project, it eventually ended up with the mass expulsion of the majority of population, the confiscation of their land and property, the destruction of their landscape, and the erasure of their geography and history. Indeed, it was the most tragic event in Palestine's 4,000-year history. But this treachery was not accidental. In 1916, while the Allies' planes were dropping leaflets on the Arabs, exhorting them to fight the Turks and gain independence and freedom, at that time, the British Mark Sykes and the French Georges Picot sat in a closed room with a map of the Middle East, planning how to carve it between them. 1 year later, Arthur James Balfour, Britain's foreign minister, concluded a secret agreement with rich European Jews to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish national home, not a state, in, not of Palestine. But he kept this agreement under lock and key. In 1917, the British forces entered Palestine for the first time ever and attacked Gaza using poison gas shells. Yes, poison gas shells. And they destroyed most of its ancient buildings. But they were defeated twice at Gaza gates. On the evening of 31st of October 1917, Allenby forces captured Beersheba in a surprise attack from the east. The gates of Palestine were laid open. On that day, Allenby sent a telegram to London on 1st of November, next day, saying, "We captured Beersheba. Jerusalem will be your Christmas present." At that time, Balfour opened his drawer and made public his secret agreement, namely his declaration, on 2nd November 1917. Balfour was not ashamed of his deed. He plainly stated, "For in Palestine we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present population of the country." He did not mention they were the majority population. But let us be practical. If these were expedient political statements, the subsequent British actions in Palestine put these words into action. The first act was to select a Zionist British minister, Herbert Samuel, to be the first High Commissioner of Palestine. In his tenure from 1920 to 1925, He created the foundations of Israel. He promulgated dozens of laws which facilitated Jewish acquisition of land and recognized Hebrew as an official language, established separate Jewish institutions, banking system, education system, labor union, Histadrut, public works, Solel Bonet, power generation, Rosenberg. But the most critical laws designed for the elimination of Palestine were the creation of a separate Jewish legislative council and separate Jewish armed forces, the Haganah, which eventually conquered Palestine. Samuel issued many of these laws without authority, neither from the League of Nations, which empowered or approved the mandate on July 24, 1922, nor an authority from the Colonial Office in London, which often rejected Samuel's formulation, but did nothing to reverse them. The flood of Jewish immigration to Palestine reached its peak about the middle of the 1930s. At the end of 1936, the total Jewish immigrant population in Palestine rose from 9% or even less at the beginning of the mandate to 28% of the whole population. Naturally, Palestinians protested. In 1937, the British Commission of Lord Peel came to investigate. Palestinians demanded what is naturally and rightly theirs. They asked for, number one, to stopping the Jewish immigration to Palestine. 2, stopping the land sales to Jews. 3, establishment of a legislative assembly where the majority of people have a voice. The Royal Commission rejected them all. In the secret files of the Commission, which now became available to us recently, you find the most racist expressions about Palestinians in the deliberation of the Royal Commission. And these utterances would today take the Speaker to court. Meanwhile, the British trained newly arrived Jewish settlers, gave them uniforms, created for them special night squads, SNS, which is the forerunner of the Palmach. This naturally ignited Palestinian Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939. The revolt was met by Britain with the utmost brutality. They did unbelievable things. The RAF bombed villages, civilian villages, they bombed them. They surrounded villages, gathered men in a square, tortured them, put them in cages without food and drink for days on end, destroyed their supplies, shot and killed farmers on the pretext they escaped. They killed surrendered captives, imposed fines on villages with amounts more than yearly income. And if they could not pay, they destroyed their homes, belongings, and animals. Long-term prison is meted out to anyone who's carrying a knife. And then they disbanded political parties and deported their leaders. At the time, the Jewish settlers joined and assisted all these activities. These settlers, later to be called Israelis, copied, honed, and improved this brutality to a fine art and applied them against Palestinians until today. The British forces in Palestine during the revolt were about 25 to 50,000 soldiers, but they were assisted by Jewish militia, up to 20,000 people. They also assisted the British in providing intelligence information. If we look at the tragedy and the victims, we can say that the minimum estimate of Palestinian casualties was 5,000 dead, 15,000 wounded, and a similar number jailed. More than 100 leaders were executed. The 80-year-old man, Sheikh Farhan al-Saadi, was hanged while fasting in Ramadan on 22nd of November 1937. This scale, we have to see it at the time. In terms of scale, about 50% of all male adults in the mountainous region of Palestine, where the revolt was particularly active, has been wounded or jailed by the British. 50% of all male adults. In the 1939, the Palestinian society was dismembered, defenseless, and leaderless. Therefore, I can say with authority that 1939 can be identified as the British-inflicted Nakba. 10 years later, Ben-Gurion found the field open. He carried out his Zionist-inflicted Nakba in 1948. But the story doesn't end here. In the remaining 6 weeks of the mandate, the Zionists attacked and depopulated 220 Palestinian villages and its main cities. But the British failed to protect Palestinians from this invasion. The Zionists in this time, 6 weeks before they were established as a state, committed dozens of massacres under the nose of the British. Deir Yassin is an infamous example, most notorious. The British chief of police in Jerusalem was few kilometers away. He was informed, but he did nothing. Even the expulsion of Palestinians in April 1948 from Tiberias was assisted by the British. They brought transport and buses to the expelled population. Even in the massive evacuation of Haifa, which is a tragic story, the British did not defend the population. On the contrary, General Stockwell, who was in charge, he was accused of being in cooperation with the Zionist attackers. His record, even today in the military history of Palestine, of Britain, is a shameless one. We have one example in my possession, the handbook of signals between the British Army patrols along the Jaffa-Jerusalem axis and their headquarters. This axis is very important. It was just a few weeks before the departure of the British. And in the period from April-May to 1948, we have a damning record of the British collusion and the failure to honor their obligations. In this book, Wireless Log, number 129 of Duty Troops, capital D, capital T, there are frequent entries showing the refusal of the British Army to rescue Palestinians when attacked by the Jewish militia. But when Jews asked for help, the troops were ordered to go and rescue them. At the end of the mandate, Britain did not hand over a functioning government to the Palestinians as its duty dictated. They did this in Cyprus, in Pakistan, in India, but not in Palestine. The British left Palestine in the hands of European Jewish settlers who were admitted to the country by Britain, trained by Britain, and actually armed by Britain as well. Ironically, this is really an irony which the British people should ponder. The settlers' first task at the time was to terrorize the British themselves and chase them out of Palestine from 1945 to 1948. Thus, it is not surprising that the unceremonious British departure from Palestine was the most shameful. Nothing like it in the history of the British Empire. The last High Commissioner of Palestine, Sir Alan Cunningham, left in a boat from Haifa. He left with no word of goodbye, neither for the winning Jews nor from the losing Arabs. But it's so unfortunate. As today we speak, Britain did not learn from this shameless record. 1 year after Nakba, Britain, together with the United States and France, issued the Tripartite Declaration of 1950. What is the purpose of this declaration? It was warning the Arabs against any attempt to reverse the destruction of Palestine and the expulsion of its people. And naturally, the history that followed repeated the same story. From the tripartite aggression of 1956, known as Zeus Campaign, to the racist remarks by Theresa May, commemorating Balfour's sin with pride, to the apostate Boris Johnson, who declared himself as a loyal Zionist. All this shows us that the Balfour legacy is still alive and well in 10 Downing Street. The debt those willful politicians have to pay is heavy and is likely to increase. Regrettably, I say regrettably, those public figures who support Palestine are hounded by well-orchestrated and well-paid lobby. The defamation of the great man and popular leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is yet another recent example. But on the bright side, I believe, and my colleague, Professor Hawash, believes, that a sizable majority of the British people today are not in agreement with this shameful policy, and they do their best to express their opinion. So finally, what do the Palestinians want? They want justice and remedy. They never cease to do that. And therefore, we call on the British government to apologize to the Palestinian people for a century of death and destruction, due its willfully failing to undertake its duties and obligations, to pay full compensation for all direct and consequential losses and damages to Palestinian people, to comply with all UN resolutions affirming the Palestinian rights, to make amends by assisting in the establishment of a future free Palestine, by means such as by correcting the policies within the United Kingdom and the international arena, such that the inalienable rights of Palestinians should be realized, by helping in the rebuilding of a future Palestine and the repatriation of its people, by teaching the Palestinian history in school curriculum and in the media, and by any other means found necessary. But in all the above, we Palestinians call on all people of good conscience in Britain, and there are many, and indeed in the world, to stand by these demands for restoring Palestine to its people and bringing justice, freedom, and peace to our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Salman, for setting the scene for us. You talked about Britain's role in the predicaments that the Palestinians feel, because that means that it wasn't simply the letter, the declaration itself. It was that continuous, if you like, a plan to create a state in Palestine, as the declaration says, for a people who were not even there at the time. That is a really significant part of the discussion. And of course, when Balfour himself made that letter, it was to effectively to the Zionist Federation. And today's lobby is still a very well organized lobby that operates not only in the UK, but operates internationally. And anyone who denies that is really not facing reality, that the continuing suffering of the Palestinian people doesn't just happen simply because governments don't want to support them, but because there is an organized lobby that is behind that. Thank you, Dr. Salman. Please continue to put your questions on YouTube and on Facebook so that we can put them to our speakers a little later. Our second speaker now is Dr. Maria Holt, who is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster, previously having a career as a political lobbyist, just talked about lobbying, specializing in the Middle East, and a parliamentary researcher. Maria will be focusing directly on the declaration's impact on Palestinian refugees and why 103 years later, the declaration's anniversary necessitates the right of return. Thank you very much for joining us, Maria, and I'm sure you'll unmute yourself and join us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Hawash, and thank you to PRC for inviting me to participate. As we're discussing this evening, the 2017 Balfour Declarations, so it's 103 years old today. And this marked the first step towards the uprooting of the Palestinian people and their current state of statelessness, as we heard from very eloquently from Professor Abu Sitta. Considered at the time by many people to be inappropriate interference, the declaration has had long-term consequences, of course, for Palestinians and Israelis, but also for Britain itself. Speaking at the United Nations in September 2016, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas referred to the notorious Balfour Declaration, by which Britain gave, without any right, authority, or consent from anyone, the land of Palestine to another people. He added that this paved the road for the Nakba of Palestinian people and their dispossession and displacement from their land. Although he is right, of course, about Britain's illegitimate actions, the declaration itself has now in many ways become somewhat irrelevant. The British government has shown little inclination to apologise to Palestinians or to make amends. While it regularly reaffirms its commitment to international law, in reality, it seemed more interested to support US President Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century. And Israel has now existed as an independent state for almost 73 years, recognized by most of the states in the world, including a growing number of Arab states. So what should concern us now, as Mahmoud Abbas said, is the continuing dispossession of the Palestinian people today in 2020. And this, I think, is the unfinished legacy of the Balfour Declaration. The Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, resulted in the uprooting of between 800,000 up to as many as 1 million Palestinians from their homes and their land. And it is these people, the Palestinian refugees and their descendants, who continue to suffer the disastrous legacy of the Balfour Declaration. Not only is their suffering unacknowledged, but their rights under international law are also under threat. In 2018, the Trump administration cut off US funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, declaring to the Palestinians, "We're not paying until you make a deal." Trump's son-in-law and Middle East envoy, Jared Kushner, has wanted to go even further by stripping Palestinians of the refugee status. He, like many supporters of Israel in the US, sees UNRWA as part of an international infrastructure that has artificially kept the refugee issue alive and kindled hopes among the exiled Palestinians that they might someday return home. Although Israel adamantly refuses this. I think this is a very dangerous time for Palestinian refugees, victims of the process set in motion by the Balfour Declaration 103 years ago. So I really just want to say a few words to make a few points about the refugees. First of all, who are they and where do they live? Palestinian refugees are defined as persons whose normal place of residence was Palestine, during the period 1st of June 1946 to 15th May 1948, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. They also lack many of the rights that other refugees enjoy or have under the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. According to UNRWA, which was a UN agency set up specifically and exclusively to deal with Palestinians made homeless in 1948, there are currently around 5 million registered Palestinian refugees, 1.5 million of whom live in 58 refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and also in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But there are also many other Palestinians living around the world who do not reside in camps and who are not registered with UNRWA. Conditions in some of the camps have been described as abysmal. They're often, especially in Lebanon, they're overcrowded, they lack basic infrastructure such as roads and sanitation. In Lebanon, the refugees are not allowed to repair or build property, even within the camps. This means that if their homes are damaged in any way, or if facilities like schools need repairs, it's illegal to fix them. Refugees also face significant health challenges, including malnutrition, which is, of course, a particular problem in Gaza. My second point highlights resilience. Despite the harsh living conditions they endure, Palestinian refugees continue to steadfastly insist on their right of return, which has been described as a universal right enshrined in international law through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention. And during my own research with refugees in Lebanon, the importance of return was constantly there is no homeland for us except Palestine, and there is no land for us but Palestine. The majority of refugees I interviewed echoed this sentiment. Although most of them have never seen their homeland, they preserve memories passed down through generations, which means that even small children know the names of their villages in Palestine. However, in the face of Israeli refusal and lack of international support, Palestinians are being forced to consider other methods to achieve their rights in the places where they live without giving up their right of return. My final point returns to the UK's role in the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. Despite the reference in the Balfour Declaration to the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, neither the British nor any other outside power attempted to protect the Palestinian people from the terrible violence accompanying the creation of the State of Israel and the subsequent violence unleashed by that state against Palestinians, whether living under harsh conditions of occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, or in exile outside of their homeland. The so-called international community, including Britain, has seemed indifferent to the plight of Palestinians, choosing not to implement international resolutions or to insist on proper treatment of civilian populations. The trouble with the current government of Boris Johnson is its rush to take advantage of what it calls new dynamics as a result of the recent agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates to put pressure on the Palestinians to prematurely resume talks. Rather than an urgent political issue, the Palestinian question has become one of humanitarian concern. It is, at its heart, a question of morality. But in this respect, the UK has shown itself to be wanting. By adopting an attitude of pragmatism to the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict and refusing to accept responsibility, the British government has demonstrated support for a harsh settler colonial project and an unwillingness to intervene in a crisis it did much to create. At a rally in Tel Aviv on 6th of June this year to protest the planned annexation of parts of the West Bank, former US Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders, speaking by video link, declared that the plans to annex any parts of the West Bank must be stopped. The occupation must be ended, and we must work together for a future of equality and dignity for all people in Israel and Palestine. His words echo historian Rashid Khalidi's suggestion that equality between the two peoples is the best way forward. Although governments such as the UK try to ignore Palestinian rights, ordinary people all over the world, including in the UK, are taking a different approach and demonstrating their support for refugees such as Palestinians made homeless through no fault of their own. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maya, for your talk. It sort of reminds us about the fact that the refugees are still refugees. Just like you, I have visited refugees in a number of the countries that they went to, and the first question they ask me is, "Where are you from?" And I say Birmingham. They say, "No. Where are you from?" And by that they mean, where in Palestine do you come from? And if the Israeli governments and the Zionist movement think that people will ever forget where they come from, then they really are very much mistaken. And this is what will keep this particular cause alive. Thank you very much indeed. And I hope that people are putting in questions to both yourself and Dr. Salman as we now move on to our final speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Malia Bouattia. Malia is an activist, the former president of the National Union of Students, a co-founder of the Students Not Suspects, Educators Not Informants Network, and is a presenter and a panelist on British Muslim TV's Women Like Us. Maria will be speaking on current UK-Israeli government relations, their celebratory reaction to the anniversary, and so on. I'm sure that was particularly the centenary one, Malia. So it's over to you, and we're really looking forward to your talk. If you could unmute and start.
Thank you very much. First, I'd just like to thank the Palestinian Return Center and its organizers for inviting me, and to all of you for attending this evening. It's an incredible honor to share the platform with such esteemed speakers and to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on the question of the Balfour Declaration and its continued relevance. As the other speakers on the panel have already alluded to, the Balfour Declaration is not only important as a historical document which laid down the foundations of the Zionist movement's colonization and settlement of Palestine, but also as a framework within which the relationships between British and Western states and Israel continue to function. It's in these contemporary relations that I'd particularly like to reflect on. Starting from the perspective of the Balfour Declaration is helpful to make sense of the British state's policies towards Israel on the one hand and towards the Palestine Solidarity Movement on the other, because it gives us a clear analytical framework that avoids unhelpful and lazy political shortcuts. The British government, under both Labour and Tory leadership, has followed for over a century now a policy of quasi-unconditional backing of Israel's colonization of Palestine through military, economic, and diplomatic support. It's done so not out of the goodness of its heart, but because of the importance of Israel in maintaining Western control and discipline over the region more generally as an access point to the region's natural resources, international trade routes, and cheap labour. Already at the time of the Balfour Declaration, British officials described the importance of Palestine as located in controlling both sides of the Suez Canal through Egypt on the one hand and Palestine on the other. And its ports where oil pipelines which ran from Kirkuk to Haifa could ease its transportation to Europe. This is important because without this framework, the energy with which the British government and other Western governments, from the US to Canada to Germany and France, supports Israel and fights the solidarity movement can seem misplaced or even irrational. There is, of course, an influential pro-Israel lobby. It is only so influential because it swims in the direction of already existing British policy and interest. The central importance of Zionism and Israel in British imperialism in the Middle East explains the ferocity of the response that the British establishment unleashed against the growing popularity of the BDS movement on the one hand, and the risk of seeing some of the demands of that movement institutionalized in the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. It was not only about defending a key ally, but also about defending its own interest. And in this sense, Johnson's post-2019 election victory move to ban publicly funded bodies like universities and local councils from imposing their own direct or indirect boycotts, divestments, or sanctions campaigns against foreign countries should be read as the most recent installment in a series of similar attempts over the last 5 to 10 years. It should also, by the way, be read as an attempt not only to criminalize the BDS movement, but also those increasingly successful campaigns to stop Britain's sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and therefore its participation in the unspeakable violence and war crimes unleashed against the people of Yemen. Making this link is again important to understand both the regional aspects of Britain's Israel policy, as well as giving the lie to repeated claims that Palestine activists unduly focus on Israel for nefarious reasons, whereas it's often the same activists who campaign against numerous injustices and crimes in the UK and across the board. The attempt to criminalize BDS at a national level follows ongoing attempts to weaken the movement in a number of important moves, which, although functioning separately from each other, are increasingly constructing a framework of political repression and silencing, of which Palestine is repeatedly a central element. And I'll mention a couple now. Most importantly is the UK's counter-extremism policy, and more specifically the PREVENT programme, which is an aspect of it. PREVENT has gone through a number of different variations, but it emerged out of the so-called war on terror to spy on and monitor the political activity of Muslims at first, and increasingly large sections of the British population. It was inscribed in law in 2015 when it became a legal duty for all workers in publicly funded institutions, so that's nurseries, schools, universities, hospitals, mental health services, and so on, to report on their students, patients, users for signs of radicalization. And these signs have always remained incredibly vague and problematic, ranging from increased religious practice to unspecified mental health conditions. The lack of clarity was a way to effectively legalize racial profiling, with Muslims being overwhelmingly overrepresented in those who were referred to the program. Whilst PREVENT as a whole served to undermine the duty of care, so central to educational and healthcare facilities, by turning care and education workers into extensions of the surveillance apparatus, it also served to normalize a dangerous assault on political freedom. Political activists were increasingly targeted by referrals to PREVENT as a whole number of campaigns, ranging from climate justice to living wage, which all became identified as signs of radicalization. And absolutely central to this was the continuous criminalization of anti-imperialism in general, and Palestine Solidarity in particular. Civil rights groups and targeted individuals repeatedly found that Palestine Solidarity in particular, and criticisms of British foreign policy in general, were key indicators to so-called nonviolent extremism in the books of PREVENT. Young people in schools and universities found themselves sent to PREVENT officers for de-radicalization, whilst events were monitored and shut down. The Charities Commission as well as well as central state funding and overview bodies like the Higher Education Funding Council for England, HEFCE, and Ofsted were crucial in this process by threatening institutions with withholding funding or certification. They were able to enforce a much more stringent repressive policy than even the central government guidelines by leveraging its power in deciding the future of institutions. Universities like SOAS in London, for example, had to submit increasingly stringent policies and monitoring, especially the Islamic and Palestine Society's activities on campus to HEFCE reviewers who repeatedly threatened to withhold the institution's degree awarding bodies. And in this sense, and there's many more examples, the so-called anti-radicalization program of the government has been a key tool to criminalize and disorganize Palestine solidarity activism. The other aspect of this process has been the move centered again on universities, but also on the Labour Party in recent years, is to impose a new institutional definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, which is so broad that it encompasses large amounts of Palestine solidarity work in its definition of hate speech and racism. For starters, the definition considers that refusing to understand Israel as a liberal democracy or to describe the creation of the Israeli state as a racist endeavor as examples of anti-Semitism. In doing so, it turns the world on its head. It makes acknowledging and opposing the racism of the Israeli state so blatantly on display for all to see, from the Nakba to the nation-state law, as a form of racism. Here again, the question is both one of alliance as well as self-preservation for the British establishment. The racism which underlines Israel's treatment of Palestinians is one which is shared with its first, but certainly not last, imperial sponsor. As speakers before me have explained so clearly, the fact that the Balfour Declaration effectively disappeared the indigenous populations of Palestine by relegating them to the rank of non-Jewish population, and therefore, in one sweep of the pen, negated their collective and national rights, rested on the long-developed colonial logic that only Europeans could enjoy political and property rights. The racist endeavor, that of colonialism and imperialism, did not start in Palestine or in 1917. It was central to the entire institution of European colonialism, which Zionism and the British Empire carried to Palestine. If we cannot name the problem, it becomes impossible to solve it. Palestine activism today in the UK, as in many other places across Europe and North America, is under assault and serves as a central focus for those trying to roll back civil liberties across the board. The fight for Palestine is then, as all solidarity should always be, not only about freeing Palestine, but about weakening British imperial power abroad and expanding our own democratic and political rights at home, defending our right to decide where our tax money goes, where our fees are invested, and which official relationships our governments, national or local, employers or educational institutions should foster, and which they should refuse, is both a struggle for Palestine as well as for Yemen and any other victim of British foreign policy and weapons exports, and the struggle for our own liberation. As the old proverb has it, either we all get free or none of us will. When 2 years ago, the British government celebrated the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, it celebrated a century of British imperialism in the Middle East. And while the thousands who wrote with indignation to the PM, which was, as is already mentioned, Theresa May back then, were right to do so, we should also take heart that it marked 100 years of continuous opposition and struggle against it, both at home and abroad. 100 years of international solidarity, 100 years of revolutionary struggle in Palestine, across the region, against oppression and exploitation. In the 1960s and 70s, the Arab left identified three main pillars of reaction: Zionism, imperialism, and the Arab regimes. That characterization remains useful today, and since the uprisings in 2011, the struggle against all three by the masses of the region has intensified even more. It's our task here to weaken our government's ability to continue to undermine their fight for liberation. As always, the struggle continues, and thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you very much indeed, Malia, for your thoughts. We've been receiving some questions, so we move now into the Q&A session. But before that, I just want to add some reality to this. People need to really think about the fact that what happened to the Palestinians was that a people who didn't live in the land came and took their land away. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened. And the reason I say that is, if you look at the Sykes-Picot Agreement and how the lands in that region were divided, and think what happened after the end of these mandates. Jordan became independent, Syria became independent, Lebanon became independent. The only place that didn't become independent for its people, and by that I mean the Palestinian people, which included Jewish, Christian, and Muslim members of that society. What should have happened? So let's think about it in this way. What should have happened is that Britain left and the Palestinians created the independent republic, if you like, of Palestine. That's what happened in the other region. That it is Palestine only where the people were not provided with their right to self-determination, so that they could create their own independent homeland. And just think how different things would have been. And that's really where I think people need to think, and to think what it is like for someone to come and take your land away, your home away. In Britain, one of the things I learned when I came very early on is that an Englishman's house is his castle. Imagine that castle being taken away from you. This is exactly what happened to the Palestinian people. I'd like to start with a question to Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, if I may. You've done fantastic work about documented what happened to the Palestinian towns, villages, the destruction, etc. And I know that you talk a lot more about planning for return rather than just the right to return. So could you just say a little bit more about what you mean? What is the difference?
Thank you, Professor Hawash. I just would like to make a remark that when we talk about 72 years, and in fact, Malia said in the 19th century, it is true, the 19th century is the century of the Western colonization of Muslim lands. This is well established. Now, the question is, even if we start from 1917 to today, if a murderer kills someone and nobody catch him, he will go and kill another person. If a burglar enters in a house and the police doesn't catch him, he goes and burgle another house. And so we have this situation from 1917 till today. We are not talking about part of a chapter in Roman history. We are talking about a constant battle between people struggling to live in their own home and homeland, and people who came from abroad for whatever reasons, for whatever motivation, for whatever support they get from Western countries. But the war is still going on. Palestinians today are 13 million people. Where are they? Half of them are on the soil of Palestine under Israeli rule in one way or another, and the other half on the borders of Palestine. In the year 2030, that's 10 years from now, we will be 18 million people. What are you going to do with those? Are you going to enslave them? You try, and they tried. We have a continuous battle from Nakba, at least 25,000 days and nights. There is a constant state of war. It is not a historical incident. It is not a footnote in history. It's happening every day, and Israelis, even with their nation state law, even with Trump and his son-in-law running the White House, even with all those, even with Arabs, some of them are succumbing to the pressure. The Israelis who are settlers and call themselves Israelis have a problem, because if all the worlds believe in them, the Palestinians don't. And as Maria said, there is an increasing number of countries recognizing Israel. I'm sure Dr. Holt knows that recognizing any country is a political act. It has no part of human rights or international law. It's a choice by any country to be politically inclined to recognize this great. Now, take this recent example. Where is the USSR? Where is Czechoslovakia? Where is Yugoslavia? The recognition is a matter of political expediency. It has nothing to do with international rights. So we go back to the main point. If we really apply the international law, if we apply one single UN resolution, 194, which has been on the table of the United Nations, regularly affirmed every year since 1948, of 11 December 1948, every year, if we take that, then the problem will be solved. What does it say? It says Palestinians who are kicked out must return home. How can we do that? What are the logistics of doing that? We have our database today tell us who are the refugees. We have millions of records. We know where they come from. We know what their land is. We know which refugee camp they are in today. We know how long it takes them to go home. In Gaza, they have to walk half a kilometer to return home. In Lebanon, they have to go 10 kilometers. And the distance between Jenin refugee camps and Lebanese refugee camps, 35 kilometers. The distance between refugee camps in Gaza and refugee camps in Al-Khalil, Hebron, and the West Bank is 45 kilometers. So we know what to do. That's number one. The international law is our side. Now we could say, some people say, oh, you'll create a Nakba for the settlers. This is, of course, immoral question and illegal question. If someone breaks into your house and kills your family, he has no right to say, I am now in your house. But even so, 87% of all Jews live today in 12% of area of Israel. We have examined 520 villages in Palestine, their land, who is on their land. Half of these are empty of Jews today. And this is published, you can find it. And the other half of these villages have kibbutz. And how many kibbutz are they? 1 to 2%. Why are they there? Because they are planted there to prevent the return of refugees. Now, all this is workable. Even we have estimate of how many houses we have to build. We have, as you know, Professor Hawash, we have an annual competition in London among young Palestinian architects to reconstruct their villages. We are now in the 5th year. There is no problem with that, but there is a big, big problem, and that is Zionism. Just like fascism and Nazism was eliminated, and then there was world peace, any such ideology must be eliminated, at least in Palestine. But if there is that ideology in Palestine, it simply means we who came from the ghettos of Eastern Europe, we are the inhabitants of Palestine. And you, the inhabitants of Palestine, have to go elsewhere. This can never happen, right? And therefore, if those settlers assume, and actually they have laws saying that we are the people of the country and you don't exist, how can you negotiate with anybody and live with anybody who denies your existence, who denies you have 2,000 years at least since Jesus Christ we lived in this country? By the way, we have records, will be published soon, that we have records of cities in 1877, in 1596, in the year 313, all Palestinians. So we have no problem with that. Therefore, Zionism must be abolished.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think it's important to know, people will immediately say, oh, you're comparing Zionism with X, Y, Z. There's no need to compare it. What it did to the Palestinians on its own, there's no need to compare it with fascism or any other, I don't want to call it an ideology because they're different, but in itself, that acceptance that it is okay to dispossess a people, to create a homeland for another people, in itself is completely wrong. No need to compare it with anything else. I'd like to put a question, if I may, to Maria. Maria, I mean, I don't know whether you're able to comment on this, but if you've had discussions with Israelis and so on, why don't they get what happened to the Palestinians? Why can't they see that what happened to the Palestinians was wrong? Because if there's going to be peace, there needs, at least in my view, the first thing is to acknowledge the wrong. So I know we're talking about Britain today, but there's also room for the Israeli society to say what happened was wrong, and for the, if you like, the peace camp there to restart, because it's been fairly dormant recently. I don't know if that's something you can comment on, but it'd be interesting to have your thoughts if you're able to do that.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I'm really not in a position to comment on Israeli perspectives. I mean, my feeling is that I mean, you're right. I mean, there used to be a peace camp, and there are, I think, Israeli citizens who are supportive of Palestinian rights, and I think there are. I mean, I don't know. I've never done research in this area, but I think there are, quite a lot of people in Israel who would like to stop this ongoing, antagonism and war and belligerence, and have some sort of peaceful resolution. I think it becomes a kind of problematic thing, though, because, for Jewish Israelis to admit that, their presence is somehow illegitimate, it's questioning the whole basis of their existence in this country. And they would say they've been there for generations now. Their children have been born there. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's. But
I mean, I maybe could turn the question differently in relation to the refugees. I mean, we see, if you like, Jewish migrants going into Palestine, and I just think they ought to really go and look at the refugee camps in Lebanon before so that they can understand. So even if we don't, if in Palestine and in Israel, the settlers or those who live in Israel can't see it, then it's so important for people who think it's all right to go and live in another people's land, because they go and live in settlements. It's not that they just go to live in if you like, inside Israel proper, as they call it. I've always thought, and I wrote about this a few years ago, that they ought to go via Lebanon, have a look and see what this is all about. Understand, if you want to go and live in the West Bank where people were dispossessed, go and see it, and then think, is it right to go and take their place? And I think just to, it might have been an unfair question to you to ask you to comment on, but I think it's until the Israeli society understands and accepts what happened, just like in South Africa, there is no way of moving on. Because unless there is an understanding of that, an acknowledgement of the Nakba, if you will, it's very difficult for this to be resolved. And if you like, if they think that by some recognition from Arab countries and others, everything will be hunky-dory, then they really are delusional. Okay, I'll put a question to Malia, if I may, because you looked at the situation in the UK. I mean, if people aren't able to raise the Palestinian question because of all these fears, or if people are targeted because of that, particularly young people, at the stage in universities and other places where they are trying to learn and to form their opinions about things, how can they then influence the decision makers? Because at the end of the day, this is the missing link. If people aren't educated about this because they fear and others fear about talking about it, how can they then influence their governments? Do you see how things might develop in that sphere to help the education happen? Dr. Salman talked about the education at, if you like, in the curriculum at school maybe, but even at university, if you close down that space, then that surely makes it really difficult to equip people with the right information to ask the right questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that realistically, and if recent political events have demonstrated anything, it's to not comply. It has to be a total disobedience of them. They are unjust, they are not right. They feed into a wider assault on civil liberties, our abilities to dissent, our abilities to politically express ourselves and to organize. And so they must be, we must be disobedient to them, but we must do so collectively. And the only ways in which we're going to have any impact on that is if we collectivize the struggle and if we collectivize that pressure. I also think in terms of the influence of government, I think, and all of us in the panel today are not naive about the lack of knowledge of our politicians, of our governments, of our leadership and representatives in relation to this political question. It's about what agendas are, what the kind of what the perspective is on the question, and that the only ways in which we're ever going to pressure any of our leaders to do something is from below. And so the influence is less about educating or lobbying softly. It is about making it impossible to ignore and to continue opposing the will of the people on the ground on questions that relate to imperialism, to colonialism, and of course in particular to our right to organize any form of Palestine solidarity, to apply the boycott, divestment and sanctions of Israel, and so on and so forth. And the collective spaces in which we can do that already exist. They are being attacked by the government continuously. They're being undermined through policies as well. And those are our unions, those are community groups, they are student spaces, they are numerous faith spaces, wherever you can bring people together to discuss something, agree that it must be opposed and defeated. That is an opportunity and a space in which we can bring such laws, such policies down.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Where have no actions been taken against US and EU for their complicity in Israeli crimes? Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. One of the questions that's come through as well, and I think that's to each of the speakers, if we can, relates to what would be a justified resolution to the UK's responsibility for the Balfour Declaration. What would you like to see the UK do now? It is still, yes, it's 103 years since that declaration was offered, but we have a current government. There will be other governments and so on. What could Britain do now today to begin to address that situation? Dr. Salman, perhaps first, any ideas how we could what we could do? I know it's might be a long answer, but that's a question.
I think the first field to attack is very simple and very much doable, namely to stop the suppression of truth about Palestine, to let people, British people and the people in the world know the bare facts, the simple facts, the facts which are found in the archives of the British government, the facts that are mentioned every day in the United Nations. When people speak about them in Britain in the media, they are shut down. And as you know, Jeremy Corbyn, what did he do? He just simply said Palestinian rights must be respected. And so is 173 countries in the world. So the first thing is to let truth be known. This bird should be released from its cage. BDS is trying to do that. And I am sure that most of the people of good conscience, when they know the facts, they know how to vote, they know what to do, they know the kind of MPs they would like to elect. And they say to their MPs, we are not going to be any more party to the crime which started some long time ago and is continuous. So the simplest answer I suggest is let the truth be known. Now we have the media, which can, like Zoom, overcomes any barriers. You don't need visas to go and talk to people, you know, and it's very cheap. All this activity is less than the cost of one tank, which is now rusting in some government store. So we should really do that. And I have great trust and great faith in the young people like Malia. And I speak to Palestine Youth Movement in the United States. I say that to them, you are the young generation, you are 20 years old, you have at least 50 or 60 years to live. So this is the inheritance we leave for you. You have to defend it.
Thank you. Maria, taking the part of your career, which was lobbying, how could Palestinians and their supporters perhaps enhance their lobbying? We heard about telling the truth as a first step, but do you have any sort of reflections or suggestions in that direction?
Well, I think I agree with Professor Abusita. I think the first step for the British government would be actually to apologise. I think they need to apologise. I think they need to acknowledge the complete wrongness of the Balfour Declaration. I think that's the starting point. I suppose then, there's lots of lobbying going on. I think it's really complicated. There are lots of, BDS is a really good example. There are lots of young people, like Malia's talking about, who are very active on behalf of Palestinian rights. And the construction of the truth, I think that's a really interesting thing. I think the British media tends to represent Palestine and Palestinians in a very negative and misleading light. So, on the kind of other side, there are lobbying and educational efforts to combat that, to challenge those sorts of assertions. But the press in Britain, the media in Britain tends to be quite pro-Israeli overall. So it's quite difficult to kind of situate alternative stories. So the general British public, which is ignorant, which really knows very little about the Arab world, about Palestine and Palestinian rights, tends to accept what it hears. What I've been involved with has been, trying to educate the public, trying to educate parliamentarians and policymakers about what's going on in Palestine. So, I've been involved in taking groups of British parliamentarians, for example, to Palestine, to show them, to take them, you're saying about the camps, to take them to refugee camps, to say, this is how Palestinians are living. Then they can come back to Britain and, talk about it in a more knowledgeable way. There are many things we can do. But I think the starting point is an apology by the British government to the Palestinian people.
So what I think the British government would argue is there's no need to apologize. What we need to do is implement the second part of the Balfour Declaration. That tends to be the response that the other communities, when the communities made up nearly 92% of the population, their rights haven't been delivered. But of course, as you heard when I read the Balfour Declaration, there was no talk of political rights. It was only about civil and religious rights. So what's your reaction to that sort of kind of argument, that it's about implementing the second part, which the government will argue it does through helping the Palestinians institution build and so on, and we have the British consul go to a school in the West Bank, which is going to be demolished to show solidarity. That seems to be the extent of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the British government is very unforthcoming. I agree with you. It should be, and it would claim that it is. If you speak to the British government, or representatives of the British government, they would say, we recognise the rights of Palestinians, but and we recognise there should be a two-state solution, and we accept all international legal responsibilities, but actually. They do not do very much to implement it. No
Yes.
action, exactly. There's very little action. And I think that's problematic. And I agree with you completely. They're very supportive, of humanitarian measures. But when it comes to political, definitions, political statements, I think they're very, very reluctant to commit to doing that. And it's very unfortunate.
Okay, Malia, in relation to what the British government can do, I know you talked about how pressure could be applied in Britain and so on. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess we need to change government policy. Whatever people think are the means to achieve that, and obviously there's no doubt that lobbying is important. Whether people think they need to do other things or not, that's a different matter. But lobbying the decision makers, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going. Just like, as you know, in 2014 there was a vote in Parliament to ask the British government to recognize Palestine. That hasn't been implemented. So why won't the British government even recognize Palestine as part of this thing? They argue it's about the second part of the agreement rather than the apology.
Yeah, so to answer the question around what we want and what we should be seeking from the British government, it is the implementation of the demands of Palestine civil society, quite simply. Cutting of diplomatic and economic and military ties with Israel until the demands of the Palestinian people are met. The right to return, the end of settlements and occupation, equal and political economic rights, and of course the lifting of the blockade on Gaza. That is the bottom line. And in terms of the questions around lobbying or implementing and, the youth, young people's movements and organizations was mentioned. And I think that we have seen some incredible action despite the huge pushback, despite the attacks, despite media demonization, despite the targeting of activists, particularly, and we've seen so many incredible, particularly Palestinian women, actually, one of which is part of the Palestinian Return Center now, Farah, have been leading incredible campaigns locally, and have even been forced to take on huge institutions who have tried to kick them out of their universities for their actions. The apartheid off campus network. There are incredible spaces that are sprouting that are refusing the inability to organize, to name the problem, which is in itself, as we've seen with the attacks to Jeremy Corbyn and within the Labour Party, becoming a struggle within itself. And so I think that all of these, that we should be drawing inspiration from all of these campaigns and all of these networks in order to apply the necessary pressure, as opposed to thinking that we're still in a phase where we could influence on the question of.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should give up on the question of influence, because we've got to keep doing that. In the UK, in the US, where, as you know, again, pressure has been applied from students. There are major changes in the US in terms of the political parties and their attitudes. And certainly, again, in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign here leads the work, whether it's on students, whether it's on the lobbying, and what we're trying to do there is both the education and the lobbying, the pressuring.
I totally agree, and I understand. And I think what I mean by like influence is, I suppose, what the government presents to us as like credible influencing or campaigning. It is narrowing what campaigning, what lobbying, what organizing is. It's criminalizing things that a few years ago we never expected to argue for or fight for. And so what I mean, so my the use of that is really undermining what the state is trying to shape in terms of political organizing. And I think that it's important to remember that in relation to what we go on to organize around.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few minutes left. I want to turn to there are possible actions from Palestine in terms of the Palestinians taking the British government to court. I'm aware of an initiative that started in Nablus only a few days ago that I think Dr. Salman will know about. I mean, not only how realistic, because we don't want to fall into the that's not possible, nothing is possible, but how realistic is it that the Palestinians, because Mahmoud Abbas, as I think Maria alluded to, I mean, he did request an apology from the British government. He did threaten at the UN. He did threaten that there would be actions against the British government. Do you think, Dr. Salman, that that's realistic, that the Palestinians could bring cases against the British government? And I know neither you or I are lawyers, but in terms of your understanding of the sort of the space, is it possible?
Well, I'd like to answer that if I can, but let me turn to Malia and the young people. We are entering into a ferocious war for the occupation of the minds. The Zionists occupied the mind of West until the First World War. This is a long story, but what I'm saying is now we should enter into the war of the occupation of the mind with clean stuff, with clean material. In answer to your question, supposing I am a lawyer and I want to take Britain to task, there are two channels which can do that. The first one is to say, is the Balfour or the mandate, the Balfour Declaration, is it legally correct or not? Now, the answer to that would depend on the law on which you depend on. At the time, there was on the League of Nations, which is a club of colonial countries, so they cannot really give you justice. This is not possible. There is not the United Nations of today. Then the second question is, assuming that the mandate is a correct document, did the British government carry it out correctly? No. On that score, the British government will be extremely guilty. First of all, it guarantees the integrity of the country. Now it didn't. It led to its dissolution into several countries. It should have protected the rights of Palestinians to live in dignity and freedom. No, it killed them. It should have allowed them to express themselves. No, it didn't. It should allow them to have a representative council or democracy, a parliament. It refused. We have documents that Churchill in 1922 said to Herbert Samuel, don't talk to them about democracy. They are waiting for the settlers to be a majority or take over the country. We have definite, now this is factual proof that they assisted the Nakba. And as I explained partly, there is so many records of that. So they were aiding and abetting criminal acts. So all these, we can take Britain to task based on their rules and their actions. So this is an open question, and it is really something which should be done.
Thank you very much. Would either of our other two speakers want to comment on that? No, okay. Okay, so I think we're coming to the end here. It is the 103rd anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. What the Palestinians want is to live in peace and dignity in their own homeland, to be free. Just to mention that in terms of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, people should always be aware of the three demands it has. Malia talked about that. I'll just reiterate them because it's really important to understand this. The first thing that it demands is an end to the occupation. That is a legal and moral claim. Secondly, that citizens of Israel should be treated equally. Where in the world would you say that different citizens should be treated differently? Nowhere. Again, a legal and moral request. And then finally, so we talked about end of the occupation. Secondly, the equal treatment of citizens. Dr. Salman talked to us about the right of the Palestinians to return. That is something that has to be respected and implemented. And if you put the three together to try and label that peaceful movement as anti-Semitic is just so wrong. It is a peaceful, legitimate, moral, and legal set of demands that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement asks for. And let's put it this way: if Israel implements these, there will be no call for boycott. It is, the ball is in its court to come into legality, to treat people equally, to end the occupation, and to let the refugees return. Because let's face it, they talk now about the fact that if all refugees return, Israel will be endangered. Well, when they were expelled from Palestine, they should have been allowed to come back straight away if the people who were coming in really wanted to coexist. But we have to question whether they ever wanted to coexist or to take the land from its rightful owners. So the Palestinians will continue to fight for their claims, their inalienable right to freedom, justice, and equality. And we must continue to put pressure here in the UK on the British government to apologize for what it did in 1917, and to actually support the Palestinians politically, not just by word, but also by deed. I would like to end by thanking our speakers, Maalia, Maria, and Salman. Thank you very much indeed for your input. I'd like to thank the PRC for giving me the opportunity to chair this session. I hope you have all found it really helpful to understand what Balfour is all about, and that we must continue the fight to support Palestinians until they are free. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Kamel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria and Maalia.